Hello, and thanks for tuning into this recording. As you've likely heard by now, Microsoft support for Windows Embedded and CE is going away. Emkat has been answering a lot of questions on what this means for our customer base, so we wanted to showcase in a quick webinar how we got here and where we're going. Let's start by spending a few moments discussing how we got here. The last major mobile platform shift was almost 20 years ago. Before moving to Windows, everything was DOS. There were no options other than text-based data collection. Maybe some of you remember the Telzon PTC960 or the Intermec 2425. These are examples of popular devices in the late 90s and early 2000s. At that time, terminal emulation dominated in the warehouse and wireless standards were still in flux. Let's look at some of the other popular technology around that time. The Nintendo 64 had just been released. Maybe you remember playing Mario Kart or Super Mario around then. Also, the first ever Palm Pilot had just hit the market. It had 128K of RAM, but could later be upgraded to 1 meg if you were willing to replace some of the internal hardware. In the early 2000s, the first devices running Pocket PC 2003 and Windows Mobile 5 appeared on the market. These devices are probably going to look a little bit more familiar to everyone. The MC9090 and the CK30 pictured here were especially popular, and I know some of you are still using these models. This was a big change. All applications needed to be rewritten from the DOS version. After an initial panic, reactions were very positive as users began to take advantage of improved hardware and software. There's a pretty good chance that if you had a phone around then, it was one of these. Of course, the height of mobile applications in these days wasn't Google Maps or Facebook, but we did have the Snake game. So, after 10 to 15 years, device hardware has changed, but surprisingly, the Windows Mobile and CE platforms have remained largely constant. Since 2010, enterprises have bought more than 15 million mobile units, 99% with a Windows Embedded OS. CE7 and Windows Embedded 6.5 platforms, the last iterations of the Windows Embedded OS, were released in 2010 and 2011, and mainstream support ended in 2013 and 2015. So like the great migration from DOS to Windows in the early 2000s, we reached another fork in the road. Where do we go from here? This is roughly 2015 now. At this point, mobility had taken off. In 2013, for the first time ever, mobile web traffic eclipsed desktop traffic worldwide. The mobile market as a whole had exploded. By now, Microsoft had effectively left the marketplace entirely. Windows Phone made up 0.15% of the install base on mobile devices worldwide in 2017. Windows Mobile was below 0.00%. Microsoft did have both Windows Phone and Windows 10 IoT, but both platforms didn't have a migration path from the older Windows embedded operating systems. Like all other options, they would require developers to completely rewrite applications. On the consumer side, Microsoft's Windows Phone platform never took off. It peaked with only 3% of the global market share. In fact, in January of 2019, Microsoft officially recommended that users of Windows 10 Mobile switch to Android or iOS. On the enterprise side, Windows IoT has been effectively abandoned, with developers not willing to invest in a platform with a bleak future and no existing adoption. Meanwhile, as everyone knows, iOS and Android have dominated the consumer space. Rugged mobile device manufacturers had a choice. iOS, being a closed platform, was not an option for a purpose-built rugged data collection device. The market could either continue with Windows Embedded and CE or invest in Android devices. So in 2015, there was time. Many considered Android immature from an enterprise perspective, but in 2019, Android has truly reached maturity and the clock is ticking for Windows CE and Embedded. Next, let's take a look at how the rugged market has embraced this change. First, let's step back to around 2017. Just a fraction of devices sold to the rugged market had a Windows 10 IoT. Android had already crept up to almost a third of all devices. Interestingly, warehouses and DCs were lagging behind. Emkat has experienced software providers needing time to catch up in this space, but new solutions are definitely emerging quickly in 2018 and 2019. So that previous slide was 2017. Now in 2019, the market has spoken. The answer is clear, and Android has been adopted. All major rugged manufacturers are effectively only releasing new devices on Android. Note that this graph is what's physically out there versus what is being sold. We checked with one of our hardware partners, Zebra, and they expect 75% of devices deployed in 2019 will be Android. In summary, moving to Android is not a question of if, but when. Note that depending on your software provider solution, the time may or may not be right for you to make the move. Emkat has been spending a lot of time speaking with organizations one-on-one to define the appropriate migration strategy. If you'd like to set up an individual consult, email sales@emkat.com and we'd be glad to help. In general, though, let's discuss some reasons why migration might make sense. So what issues are there with running on the old platform? Well, obviously, the legacy mobile platforms are reaching end of life. Security updates may be available through vendor support, but the platform limits what is possible. And syncing with PCs has become more difficult without Microsoft support past Vista. Satisfaction with existing solutions is waning. The solutions available are hamstrung by the dated platform. Certainly, the costs of supporting and maintaining legacy solutions and applications are increasing. Inability to leverage advances in modern mobile devices. So modern web apps often cannot run on these older devices, and more often than not, new solutions cannot be retrofit to the older OS and hardware. Changing expectations of the incoming workforce. Touch support is limited on these older devices. The newer workers are not familiar with a device that feels like it's 15 years old. Keep in mind that some of these workers never even played a Nintendo 64 or know what a Palm Pilot is. So what issues are important to users? This slide shows VDC research survey results. The big items are speed and accuracy, getting information processed without errors as quickly as possible. Technology modernization, taking advantage of modern hardware and software. Labor optimization, getting new workers up to speed as quickly as possible. This is a big one. Worker onboarding is a big issue in today's labor market. In the warehouse, the current average onboarding time for a new worker is close to 4 weeks. This can be drastically reduced with modern hardware and software. So what does the new platform bring? We have a lot of new technology at our fingertips. Leveraging a modern UI experience for data collection only makes sense. There are several ways to do this with Android. Among other things, new devices are more touch-based and have less physical keys. We can now take advantage of gesture-based functionality. New devices leverage larger screens. This is exciting. The move from 90s era text-based data collection to touch-based solutions is possible with Android. There are several tools available that allow us to take a traditional terminal emulation session and reformat it for modern devices. Taking text to buttons or icons has shown to dramatically improve worker productivity. This last slide shows some research done to prove that out. We're looking at typing speeds 39% higher, 60% less errors, and up to 15 to 20% overall improvement in productivity. So that's a bit about the history of the Android migration in the rugged space and some of the exciting opportunities that new devices bring to the table. Thanks for listening.